Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
You're around a group of dudes and they get excited. It doesn't matter where you are on the continent. They all say the same thing. Just, let's fucking go. Let's go. Dudes are all about going. Let's go. Go team go. That song goes hard. I'm going in. Ladies get excited. It's the opposite. Ladies get excited. They're like, stop. Stop it. Shut the fuck up. I can't even. No wonder we have so much trouble communicating. We have the same emotion. We say the opposite thing. Let's go. Stop. What's wrong with these girls? Guys, man. Let's go. Girls, stop. Non-binary, yield.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Radical Saturday, October the 12th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, ideas have consequences, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and rules for radicals. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
It is because freedom means the renunciation of direct control of individual efforts that a free society can make use of so much more knowledge than the mind of the wisest ruler could comprehend. F.A. Hayek. You may want to read this one several times to let it sink in. In a free society, the collective knowledge of all the individuals in it is at use. It is not suppressed. It has distributive powers, and its applications are monumental and miraculous. The conscious decision to replace the power of that collective knowledge expressed in a free and open marketplace with the limited, broken, misapplied, and misaligned knowledge of a central planner is one of the great mysteries of modern times and one of its great iniquities.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Rule number 7. Adapt the time-honored conservative message for a new kind of America and a new kind of American. The demographic changes unleashed by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, part of the late Senator Ted Kennedy's immutable legacy, are only now being felt. While in retrospect they seem inevitable, Senator Kennedy explicitly denied their likelihood. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, the bill will not inundate America with immigrants from any one country or area. In the final analysis, the ethnic pattern of immigration under the proposed measure is not expected to change as sharply as the critics seem to think. The bill will not flood our cities with immigrants. It will not relax the standards of admission. It will not cause American workers to lose their jobs. Okay, so it didn't quite work out that way. So what? Nativism, or as we call it out here in Hollywood, jingoism, is the sin most easily attached to the right by the left. Although historically we've been far more guilty of it from the Klan on. And it's something we've been trying to pin on you since time immemorial. But by embracing the changing demographics, by treating non-European Americans as Americans, instead of various victim voting blocs whose votes must be bought and whose tender sensibilities must at all times be appeased through the enforcement mechanism of political correctness, abetted by the media's narrative, the right has a huge opportunity to put paid to the left's victimization meme once and for all. Therefore, corollary number 1, put your money where your principles are and demonstrate that you welcome New Look America as long as it stays America. Because either all men are created equal, or they aren't. By rights, you wingnut should be a shining testament to the hypocrisy of our stated, although in practice nearly non-existent, liberal virtues. The famous twins of fairness and tolerance. But instead, you've let us project all of our many and manifold sins upon you for lo these last 2 centuries. If you'd ever learn how to articulate the principles that created the United States in the first place, and that animate you now, in a language anyone, no matter their country of origin, can understand, you'd be dangerous. Nativism has been a scourge since the Irish started arriving in large numbers in the mid-19th century. So it's long past time you Rotarians started displaying your faith in both the adaptive and the adoptive nature of this country. The country hasn't changed, but the ethnic makeup of the populace has, and will continue to do so. So either you believe in the created equal jazz, or you don't. Time to put your money where your mouths are. And this is also how you're finally going to be able to lose that racist meme once and for all. As I've shown you, the real racists in this fight are us. The father of lies is to hypocrisy born. And if you buy my theory that we consistently accuse you of what we're either thinking or actually doing, then you understand the truth of Rochefoucauld's dictum that hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. Frankly, if we were left to run things without any interference from you, we'd have the very platonic form of a police state, in which rich liberals like me and my friends, philosopher kings, the kind of people this country needs and who ought to be protected, would live peaceful, contented lives, dabbling at professions like teaching and politics that don't really require much in the way of an education, or even effort. We'd live in a world in which artists like me were publicly supported at taxpayer expense. The example of Jean Sibelius in Finland comes to mind. Worked hard, became famous, got a government stipend, and then basically never composed another tune as long as he lived. Where a seat in state or national government was tantamount to a lifetime sinecure. We're almost there now. And august Solons could swan about, fretting over the plight of the little guy, and then flying home for the weekend to oversee their vineyards in the Napa Valley. And as for the little guy, well, that would be mostly people of color, hired as government employees for make-work projects, or to sit in some air-conditioned office all day, watching television and pretending to work. The rest of them, we'd have to carefully calibrate the number so the tax base would be large enough, would either slave away all day at dead-end jobs, turn to crime, or something. We don't care. Just as long as the cops can continue to protect us from our historic relationship with the proletariat, we're fine with it. After all, they don't live in our neighborhoods. They just vote like they do. That's the great mystery and wonder of it all, of course. Why they vote like they do.
And that was the beginning of Chapter 26 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rule 2 from Rules for Retrogrades.
Rule 2. Conservatism is inherently Christian. Intellectual conservatism is inherently Roman Catholic. In America specifically, conservatism's guts have been Protestant, but its brains must be Catholic. It is true in Western civilization generally. This is because Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, together with the Christian scripture and tradition, informed the unique basis of all that's good in ancient and medieval Europe, which created Western culture. The retrograde needs to be aware of this and spread the message. The best of American values and Western triumphalism reduces to the teachings of Aristotomism. Aristotle lays out the sine qua nons for Western anthropology, justifying the interaction between man's free will, habit, virtue, politics, and culture. St. Thomas most aptly shows how Christian tradition and scripture perfected these Aristotelian building blocks of culture. Goodies like natural rights and limited government emanate uniquely from this source. But in recent centuries, Aristotle and St. Thomas deliberately have been robbed of their due credit. On the right hand, the Reformation rejected this Aristotomist basis for Western culture at behest of sola scriptura. On the left hand, the Enlightenment made the same dismissal, except premised upon anti-Christian scientism. In other words, the two movements rejected Aristotomism for opposite reasons. Things played out interestingly in America. When their Protestant Enlightenment worldview came up wanting, the American founders and colonial and antebellum American culture secretly drew heavily on Aristotomism, while unabashedly denouncing Aristotle and Thomas. These two figures are basically the American retrogrades' dark knights, gathering all the unique blame and none of the due credit. All republics live out a three-phase life cycle. First, breaking the old regime, and then making the new regime, and finally, staking the new regime in the culture. Aristotomism proves indispensable for all three phases. This is seen in American history specifically and in all republics generally. Breaking the old regime. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence announced the breaking of the English rule over the American colonies. In the American Republic, before it was even technically a republic, founders such as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams secretly drew on a Thomist natural rights tradition. Footnote: the natural rights tradition includes thinkers like Robert Bellarmine, and Protestant political thinkers who drew on Bellarmine and Aquinas. End of footnote. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams secretly drew on a Thomistic natural rights tradition in formulation and defense of the Declaration of Independence. Although the young colonies were peopled by Protestants outwardly hostile to Thomism, the natural rights of the Declaration proved to be unimaginable and incoherent without Thomas Aquinas's arrangement thereof, making the new regime. In 1787 and 1788, the drafting and ratifying of the U.S. Constitution memorialized the making of the new American regime, premised upon the violations of American rights enumerated in the previous decade's Declaration. Framers of the U.S. Constitution, like James Madison, recognized that natural rights in republics were best secured by localism, a principle derived from the Catholic concept of subsidiarity. Once again, this Republican desideratum came from the overlooked or maligned lineage of classical thinkers such as Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Robert Bellarmine, the Spanish theologians of the school of Salamanca, and Montesquieu. Madison and the framers called the concept federalism, not subsidiarity, although it proves to be a simple Reformation Enlightenment reproduction thereof. Staking the new regime in the culture. All the American founders and framers agreed that a good new constitution accomplished nothing without implantation within a virtuous political culture. In other words, the real life of a republic is lived after its foundational documents have been ratified. The baton, as it were, needed to be passed from 1770s revolutionaries and 1780s constitutionalists to the everyday American of the 1790s and thereafter. Yet even within a Protestant citizenry, this required all the marks of a Catholic people: virtue ethics in the populace, a Christian humanism based upon a sacramental order, a family economy, and a science and technology sector based upon Aristotelian realism. All these elements of culture required a Thomistic view of the human person, even as the young republic technically rejected the church's insistence upon it. While ecumenical conservative values can be broadly construed as Christian without contradiction, now busted is the tired old myth about the congruity between Puritan political acumen, which denies outright the possibility of liberty and virtue, and American values. The more specifically one wants and labors to ascribe American values to Protestantism, the more vigorously he must be rebuffed. This task falls to the retrograde, as he disabuses misinformed Americans of their political and cultural misconceptions. He replaces Puritanism with Aristotomism as America's intellectual lodestar. Finally, the retrograde must understand that small government can't be accomplished within a morally pluralistic society or over large land masses. Small government requires small spaces with alert, active, virtuous, retrograde citizens prepared to organize themselves in an equal and opposite way to the demands of Saul Alinsky.
And that was Rule 2 from Rules for Retrogrades by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 2 of Ideas Have Consequences.
Chapter 2. Distinction and Hierarchy. For if all things had come into being in this automatic fashion, instead of being the outcome of mind, they would all be uniform and without distinction. St. Athanasius. The most portentous general event of our time is the steady obliteration of those distinctions which create society. Rational society is a mirror of the logos.
And this means that it has a formal structure which enables apprehension. The preservation of society is therefore directly linked with the recovery of true knowledge. For the success of our restoration, it cannot be too often said that society and mass are contradictory terms, and that those who seek to do things in the name of mass are the destroyers in our midst. If society is something which can be understood, it must have structure. If it has structure, it must have hierarchy. Against this metaphysical truth, the declamations of the Jacobins break in vain. Perhaps the most painful experience of modern consciousness is the felt loss of center. Yet, this is the inevitable result of centuries of insistence that society yield its form. Anyone can observe that people today are eager to know who is really entitled to authority, that they are looking wistfully for the sources of genuine value. In some, they wish to know the truth, but they have been taught a perversion which makes their chance of obtaining it less every day. This perversion is that in a just society there are no distinctions. Our course has reached a point at which the question of whether man wishes to live in society at all, or whether he wishes to live in a kind of animal relationship, must be raised in all seriousness. For, if the proscription against every kind of distinction continues, there is no hope of integration except on the level of instinct. After man evolves his metaphysical dream and becomes capable of rational sentiment, he recognizes two grounds of elevation, knowledge, and virtue. If these are not one, which problem need not be decided here. The good man, the man with proved allegiance to correct sentiment, has been the natural trustee of authority. The man of knowledge has been necessary for such duties as require system and foresight. With these criteria, it has been possible to erect a structure which mirrors our respect for value. In proportion to their contributions to the spiritual ideal which the creation expresses, men have found lodgment on the various levels, with the essential feeling that, since this structure is the logos, their stations were not arbitrary, but natural and right. This is society, in which the human being has a sense of direction. Literally, it might be said, he knows up from down, because he knows where the higher goods are to be looked for. It is possible for him to live on the plane of spirit and intelligence because some points of reference are fixed. Obviously, this is not a social situation in which everyone is called Joe, that anonymous name so eloquent of modern man's feeling about people. If sentiment endures, there will be real names and even honorifics. For the good of all, prerogative will attach to higher functions, and this will mean hierarchy. But hierarchy requires a common assumption about ends, and that is why the competing ideologies of our age produce confusion. The history of our social disintegration began with the unfixing of relationships in the 14th century, but the effort to do away with society entirely did not become programmatic until the 19th, when it appeared as a culmination of the prevailing nature philosophy. Since both knowledge and virtue require the concept of transcendence, they are really obnoxious to those committed to material standards, and we have seen how insistent was the impulse to look to the lower levels for guidance. Into social thinking, there now enters a statistical unit, the consumer, which has the power to destroy utterly that metaphysical structure supporting hierarchy. Let us remember that traditional society was organized around king and priest, soldier and poet, peasant and artisan. Now, distinctions of vocation fade out, and the new organization, if such it may be termed, is to be around capacities to consume. Underlying the shift is the theory of romanticism. If we attach more significance to feeling than to thinking, we shall soon, by a simple extension, attach more to wanting than to deserving. Even institutions of learning have yielded to the utilitarian standard, and former President James B. Conant of Harvard University declared in an address that the chief contribution of American universities had been the idea of equality of all useful labor. This is the grand solution of socialism, which is itself the materialistic offspring of bourgeois capitalism.
And that was the first part of Chapter 2 of Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Why do you need to impress these people again? If you should ever turn your will to things outside your control in order to impress someone, be sure that you have wrecked your whole purpose in life. Be content, then, to be a philosopher in all that you do. And if you wish also to be seen as one, show yourself first that you are, and you will succeed. Epictetus, Enchiridion, 23. Is there anything sadder than the immense lengths we'll go to impress someone? The things we'll do to earn someone's approval can seem, when examined in retrospect, like the result of some temporary form of insanity. Suddenly we're wearing uncomfortable, ridiculous clothes we've been told are cool, eating differently, talking differently, eagerly waiting for a call or text. If we did these things because we liked it, that would be one thing. But that's not what it is. It's just a means to an end, to get someone to give us the nod. The irony, as Marcus Aurelius points out repeatedly, is that the people whose opinion we covet are not all that great. They're flawed. They're distracted and wowed by all sorts of silly things themselves. We know this, and yet we don't want to think about it. To quote Fight Club again, we buy things we don't need to impress people we don't like. Doesn't that sound pretty ridiculous? But more than that, isn't it about as far as possible as you can get from the serenity and security that philosophy can provide?
And that was The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
We combine in our persons the spiritual and the material. Look at the spiritual side. We can study, Einstein, and we can study the great scientists. We can design spacecraft that will fly to distant planets. We can pray in such a refined way that we almost lose our contact with the earth and we rise up toward heaven. Our spiritual side is on clear display. At the same time, we have bodies. We get tired and we get too hot or too cold, and we have to sleep and we have to eat and drink. We're both spirit and matter. It's the unique way that God has made us. God did make the angels pure spirits to give him glory in their distinctive way. God did make purely material things. They give glory to God in their unique way. And he made us hybrids of body and soul. It's our glory, and it's our agony.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day.
Who are you, Ayn Rand? When I say that, I would like to know just a little bit of your vital statistics. You have an accent which is...
Russian.
Russian. You were born in Russia?
Yes.
Came here?
About 30 years ago.
And whence did this philosophy of yours come?
Out of my own mind. With the sole acknowledgement of a debt to Aristotle, who is the only philosopher that ever influenced me. I devised the rest of my philosophy myself.
And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, this 33 strategies of war.
But there is another way to look at the attack, keeping in mind the chain reaction that is always the terrorist's goal. The full economic impact of 9/11 is hard to measure, but the ripple effect of the attack is by any standard immense and undeniable. Substantial increases in security costs, including the funding of new government programs for that purpose, enormous military expenditures on the invasions of two separate nations, a depressive effect on the stock market, always particularly susceptible to the psychology of panic, and a consequent injury to consumer confidence, hits on specific industries such as travel and tourism, and the reverberating effect of all these on the global economy. The attack also had tremendous political effects. In fact, the American elections of 2002 and 2004 were arguably determined by it. And as the chain reaction has continued to play out, a growing rift has emerged between the United States and its European allies.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War. And so far, in regards to his analysis, if you will, of the 9/11 situation, everything he is saying, if you notice and listen carefully, is completely arbitrary. He doesn't back any of it up. He provides no evidence, no proofs. It's all speculation, conjecture, and demands that we take his word for it. And when you're dealing with that kind of thing, somebody asking you to take their word for it, it's optional. We can decide to go ahead and take his word for it, or we can ignore him. Back in a minute. Thank you. So, one of the things I just discovered was about contrary versus contradictory. So many idiots on the right, like Sean Hannity, think that in order to be good patriots, that they have to constantly contradict the left. Whatever the left says, then we should provide a contradictory statement or action. Well, what if the left says they're for peace? Then are you going to say, well, I'm for war? If they say that I'm for women's health, you're for what? Women's bad health? That's stupid. So instead of doing what's contradictory, what we should be doing and what I should be doing is looking for the contrary. So, for instance, diversity. We don't look at diversity as a way of a trap or a potential trap for to get you again to contradict. But if you provide something contrary like integration, that's the solution. That's the key that fits perfectly in the lock. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because today's society increasingly divests itself of the negativity of the other or the foreign. The process of globalization accelerates the dissolution of borders and distinctions. Yet, the depletion of negativity should not be equated with the disappearance of violence, since along with the violence of negativity, there's a violence of positivity, which is wielded without enmity or domination. Violence isn't merely an excess of negativity. It can also be an excess of positivity. The accumulation of the positive, which manifests as overachievement, overproduction, overcommunication, hyperattention, and hyperactivity. The violence of positivity is possibly even more disastrous than that of negativity because it is neither visible nor evident, and it evades immunological defense because of its positivity. Infection, invasion, and infiltration, which are characteristic of the violence of negativity, now give way to infarction. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, and this is what he calls The Purpose. And it's 50 minutes long, so I'm going to cut it in half, do 25 minutes this week and 25 minutes next.
Rules for Radicals. The Purpose. The life of man upon earth is a warfare. Job 7:1. What follows is for those who want to change the world from what it is to what they believe it should be. The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold power. Rules for Radicals is written for the have-nots on how to take it away. In this book, we are concerned with how to create mass organizations to seize power and give it to the people. To realize the democratic dream of equality, justice, peace, cooperation, equal and full opportunities for education, full and useful employment, health, and the creation of those circumstances in which man can have the chance to live by values that give meaning to life. We are talking about a mass power organization which will change the world into a place where all men and women walk erect, in the spirit of that credo of the Spanish Civil War, better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. This means revolution. The significant changes in history have been made by revolutions. There are people who say that it is not revolution, but evolution that brings about change. But evolution is simply the term used by non-participants to denote a particular sequence of revolutions as they synthesized into a specific major social change. In this book, I propose certain general observations, propositions, and concepts of the mechanics of mass movements and the various stages of the cycle of action and reaction in revolution. This is not an ideological book, except insofar as argument for change, rather than for the status quo, can be called an ideology. Different people in different places, in different situations and different times will construct their own solutions and symbols of salvation for those times. This book will not contain any panacea or dogma. I detest and fear dogma. I know that all revolutions must have ideologies to spur them on, that in the heat of conflict these ideologies tend to be smelted into rigid dogmas claiming exclusive possession of the truth and the keys to paradise is tragic. Dogma is the enemy of human freedom. Dogma must be watched for and apprehended at every turn and twist of the revolutionary movement. The human spirit glows from that small inner light of doubt, whether we are right, while those who believe with complete certainty that they possess the right are dark inside and darken the world outside with cruelty, pain, and injustice. Those who enshrine the poor, or have-nots, are as guilty as other dogmatists and just as dangerous. To diminish the danger that ideology will deteriorate into dogma, and to protect the free, open, questing, and creative mind of man, as well as to allow for change, no ideology should be more specific than that of America's founding fathers, for the general welfare. Niels Bohr, the great atomic physicist, admirably stated the civilized position on dogmatism. Every sentence I utter must be understood not as an affirmation, but as a question. I will argue that man's hopes lie in the acceptance of the great law of change, that a general understanding of the principles of change will provide clues for rational action and an awareness of the realistic relationship between means and ends and how each determines the other. I hope that these pages will contribute to the education of the radicals of today, and to the conversion of hot, emotional, impulsive passions that are impotent and frustrating to actions that will be calculated, purposeful, and effective. An example of the political insensitivity of many of today's so-called radicals and the lost opportunities is found in this account of an episode during the trial of the Chicago 7. Over the weekend, some 150 lawyers from all parts of the country had gathered in Chicago to picket the federal building in protest against Judge Hoffman's arrest of the 4 lawyers. This delegation, which was supported by 13 members of the faculty of Harvard Law School, and which included a number of other professors as well, submitted a brief as friend of the court, which called Judge Hoffman's actions a travesty of justice, which threatens to destroy the confidence of the American people in the entire judicial process. By 10 o'clock, the angry lawyers had begun to march around the federal building, where they were joined by hundreds of student radicals, several Black Panthers, and 100 or more blue-helmeted Chicago police. Shortly before noon, about 40 of the picketing lawyers carried their signs into the lobby of the federal building, despite the notice posted on the glass wall beside the entrance, and signed by Judge Campbell, forbidding such demonstrations within the building. Hardly had the lawyers entered, however, than Judge Campbell himself descended to the lobby, dressed in his black robes and accompanied by a marshal, a stenographer, and his court clerk. Surrounded by the angry lawyers, who were themselves encircled by a ring of police and federal marshals, the judge proceeded to hold court then and there. He announced that unless the pickets withdrew immediately, he would charge them with contempt. This time, he warned, there could be no question that their contempt would occur in the presence of the court, and would thus be subject to summary punishment. No sooner had he made this announcement, however, than a voice from the throng shouted, "Fuck you, Campbell." After a moment of tense silence, followed by a cheer from the crowd and a noticeable stiffening among the police, Judge Campbell himself withdrew. Then the lawyers, too, left the lobby and rejoined the pickets on the sidewalk. Jason Epstein, The Great Conspiracy Trial, Random House, 1970. The picketing lawyers threw away a beautiful opportunity to create a nationwide issue. Offhand, there would seem to have been two choices, either of which would have forced the judge's hand and kept the issue going. Some one of the lawyers could have stepped up to the judge after the voice said, "Fuck you, Campbell," said that the lawyers there did not support personal obscenities, but they were not leaving. Or all the lawyers together could have chorused with one voice, "Fuck you, Campbell." They did neither. Instead, they let the initiative pass from them to the judge and achieved nothing. Radicals must be resilient, adaptable to shifting political circumstances, and sensitive enough to the process of action and reaction to avoid being trapped by their own tactics and forced to travel a road not of their choosing. In short, radicals must have a degree of control over the flow of events. Here, I propose to present an arrangement of certain facts and general concepts of change, a step toward a science of revolution. All societies discourage and penalize ideas and writings that threaten the ruling status quo. It is understandable, therefore, that the literature of a have society is a veritable desert whenever we look for writings on social change. Once the American Revolution was done with, we can find very little besides the right of revolution that is laid down in the Declaration of Independence as a fundamental right. 73 years later, Thoreau's brief essay on the duty of civil disobedience, followed by Lincoln's reaffirmation of the revolutionary right in 1861. As he said in his first inaugural, "This country, with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it." There are many phrases extolling the sacredness of revolution, that is, revolutions of the past. Our enthusiasm for the sacred rite of revolution is increased and enhanced with the passage of time. The older the revolution, the more it recedes into history, the more sacred it becomes. Except for Thoreau's limited remarks, our society has given us few words of advice, few suggestions of how to fertilize social change. From the haves, on the other hand, there has come an unceasing flood of literature justifying the status quo. Religious, economic, social, political, and legal tracts endlessly attack all revolutionary ideas and action for change as immoral, fallacious, and against God, country, and mother. These literary sedations by the status quo include the threat that, since all such movements are unpatriotic, subversive, spawned in hell, and reptilian in their creeping insidiousness, dire punishments will be meted out to their supporters. All great revolutions, including Christianity, the various reformations, democracy, capitalism, and socialism, have suffered these epithets in the times of their birth. To the status quo concerned about its public image, revolution is the only force which has no image, but instead casts a dark, ominous shadow of things to come. The have-nots of the world, swept up in their present upheavals and desperately seeking revolutionary writings, can find such literature only from communists, both red and yellow. Here they can read about tactics, maneuvers, strategy, and principles of action in the making of revolutions. Since in this literature all ideas are embedded in the language of communism, revolution appears synonymous with communism. As U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas wrote in The U.S. and Revolution, Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, Occasional Paper, number 116. On trips to Asia, I often asked men in their 30s and 40s what they were reading when they were 18. They usually answered Karl Marx, and when I asked them why, they replied, "We were under colonial rule, seeking a way out. We wanted our independence. To get it, we had to make revolution." The only books on revolution were published by the communists. These men almost invariably had repudiated communism as a political cult, retaining, however, a tinge of socialism. As I talked with them, I came to realize the great opportunities we missed when we became preoccupied in fighting communism with bombs and with dollars, rather than with ideas of revolution, of freedom, of justice. When, in the throes of their revolutionary fervor, the have-nots hungrily turn to us in their first steps from starvation to subsistence, we respond with a bewildering, unbelievable, and meaningless conglomeration of abstractions about freedom, morality, equality, and the danger of intellectual enslavement by communistic ideology. This is accompanied by charitable handouts dressed up in ribbons of moral principle and freedom, with the price tag of unqualified political loyalty to us. With the coming of the revolutions in Russia and China, we suddenly underwent a moral conversion and became concerned for the welfare of our brothers all over the world. Revolution by the have-nots has a way of inducing a moral revelation among the haves. Revolution by the have-nots also induces a paranoid fear. Now, therefore, we find every corrupt and repressive government the world around saying to us, "Give us money and soldiers, or there will be a revolution, and the new leaders will be your enemies." Fearful of revolution and identifying ourselves as the status quo, we have permitted the communists to assume by default the revolutionary halo of justice for the have-nots. We then compound this mistake by assuming that the status quo everywhere must be defended and buttressed against revolution. Today, revolution has become synonymous with communism, while capitalism is synonymous with status quo. Occasionally, we will accept a revolution if it is guaranteed to be on our side, and then only when we realize that the revolution is inevitable. We abhor revolutions. We have permitted a suicidal situation to unfold wherein revolution and communism have become one. These pages are committed to splitting this political atom, separating this exclusive identification of communism with revolution. If it were possible for the have-nots of the world to recognize and accept the idea that revolution did not inevitably mean hate and war, cold or hot, from the United States, that alone would be a great revolution in world politics and the future of man. This is a major reason for my attempt to provide a revolutionary handbook not cast in a communist or capitalist mold, but as a manual for the have-nots of the world, regardless of the color of their skins or their politics. My aim here is to suggest how to organize for power, how to get it and to use it. I will argue that the failure to use power for a more equitable distribution of the means of life for all people signals the end of the revolution and the start of the counter-revolution. Revolution has always advanced with an ideological spear, just as the status quo has inscribed its ideology upon its shield. All of life is partisan. there is no dispassionate objectivity. The revolutionary ideology is not confined to a specific limited formula. It is a series of general principles rooted in Lincoln's May 19th, 1856 statement, "Be not deceived, revolutions do not go backward." The ideology of change. This raises the question, what, if any, is my ideology? What kind of ideology, if any, can an organizer have who is working in and for a free society? The prerequisite for an ideology is possession of a basic truth. For example, a Marxist begins with his prime truth that all evils are caused by the exploitation of the proletariat by the capitalists. From this, he logically proceeds to the revolution to end capitalism, then into the third stage of reorganization into a new social order, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, and finally the last stage, the political paradise of communism. The Christians also begin with their prime truth, the divinity of Christ and the tripartite nature of God. Out of these prime truths flow a step-by-step ideology. An organizer working in and for an open society is in an ideological dilemma. To begin with, he does not have a fixed truth. Truth to him is relative and changing. Everything to him is relative and changing. He is a political relativist. He accepts the late Justice Learned Hand's statement that the mark of a free man is that ever-gnawing inner uncertainty as to whether or not he is right. The consequence is that he is ever on the hunt for the causes of man's plight and the general propositions that help to make some sense out of man's irrational world. He must constantly examine life, including his own, to get some idea of what it is all about, and he must challenge and test his own findings. Irreverence, essential to questioning, is a requisite. Curiosity becomes compulsive. His most frequent word is why. Some say it's no coincidence that the question mark is an inverted plow, breaking up the hard soil of old beliefs and preparing for the new growth. Does this then mean that the organizer in a free society for a free society is rudderless? No. I believe that he has a far better sense of direction and compass than the closed society organizer with his rigid political ideology. First, the free society organizer is loose, resilient, fluid, and on the move in a society which is itself in a state of constant change. To the extent that he is free from the shackles of dogma, he can respond to the realities of the widely different situations our society presents. In the end, he has one conviction, a belief that if people have the power to act, in the long run, they will, most of the time, reach the right decisions. The alternative to this would be rule by the elite, either a dictatorship or some form of political aristocracy. I am not concerned if this faith in people is regarded as a prime truth and therefore a contradiction of what I have already written, for life is a story of contradictions. Believing in people, the radical has the job of organizing them so that they will have the power and opportunity to best meet each unforeseeable future crisis as they move ahead in their eternal search for those values of equality, justice, freedom, peace, a deep concern for the preciousness of human life, and all those rights and values propounded by Judeo-Christianity and the democratic political tradition. Democracy is not an end, but the best means toward achieving these values. This is my credo, for which I live, and if need be, die. The basic requirement for the understanding of the politics of change is to recognize the world as it is. We must work with it on its terms if we are to change it to the kind of world we would like it to be. We must first see the world as it is, and not as we would like it to be. We must see the world as all political realists have, in terms of what men do and not what they ought to do, as Machiavelli and others have put it. It is painful to accept fully the simple fact that one begins from where one is, that one must break free of the web of illusions one spins about life. Most of us view the world not as it is, but as we would like it to be. The preferred world can be seen any evening on television in the succession of programs where the good always wins. That is, until the late evening newscast, when suddenly we are plunged into the world as it is. With some exceptions, in one of America's Shangri-Las of escape from the world as it is, Carmel by the Sea, California, on the coast of the beautiful Monterey Peninsula, radio station KRML used to broadcast the Sunshine News, which headlines the positive, only the good news of the world. Intellectuals who would scoff at Sunshine News are no exception to the preference for already formulated answers. Political realists see the world as it is, an arena of power politics moved primarily by perceived immediate self-interests, where morality is rhetorical rationale for expedient action and self-interest. Two examples would be the priest who wants to be a bishop and bootlicks and politics his way up, justifying it with the rationale. After I get to be bishop, I'll use my office for Christian reformation. Or the businessman who reasons, first I'll make my million, and after that, I'll go for the real things in life. Unfortunately, one changes in many ways on the road to bishopric, or the first million, and then one says, I'll wait until I'm a cardinal, and then I can be more effective. Or, I can do a lot more after I get 2 million. And so it goes. Each year, for a number of years, the activists in the graduating class from a major Catholic seminary near Chicago would visit me for a day just before their ordination with questions about values, revolutionary tactics, and such. Once, at the end of such a day, one of the seminarians said, Mr. Alinsky, before we came here, we met and agreed that there was one question we particularly wanted to put to you. We're going to be ordained, and then we'll be assigned to different parishes as assistants to, frankly, stuffy, reactionary old pastors. They will disapprove of a lot of what you and we believe in, and we will be put into a killing routine. Our question is, how do we keep our faith in true Christian values, everything we hope to do to change the system? That was easy. I answered, when you go out that door, just make your own personal decision about whether you want to be a bishop or a priest, and everything else will follow. In this world, laws are written for the lofty aim of the common good, and then acted out in life on the basis of the common greed. In this world, irrationality clings to man like his shadow, so that the right things are done for the wrong reasons. Afterwards, we dredge up the right reasons for justification. It is a world not of angels, but of angles, where men speak of moral principles, but act on power principles. A world where we are always moral, and our enemies always immoral. A world where reconciliation means that when one side gets the power and the other side gets reconciled to it, then we have reconciliation. A world of religious institutions that have, in the main, come to support and justify the status quo, so that today organized religion is materially solvent and spiritually bankrupt. We live with a Judeo-Christian ethic that has not only accommodated itself to, but justified slavery, war, and every other ugly human exploitation of whichever status quo happened to prevail.
And that was his sort of like a prologue, I guess, from Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals, at the first half of this particular chapter. And he, again, then is using a lot of one of the techniques he uses primarily here is one of take my word for it. So like his ending statement about how organized religion has accepted or promoted slavery and all kinds he doesn't offer any evidence or proof. He just demands that you take his word for it. And taking people's word for it is optional. We can take their word for it, or we can decide to check on it and find out for ourselves. So that was Rules for Radicals. And next week, the second half of this chapter. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to trust yourself and trust your conscience.